So we have just completed talking about epithelial and connective tissue, which are the tougher two types of tissue. So let's summarize them into 4 types of tissue membranes that we can have in the body. One is that there are mucous membranes that line your passageway and chambers, okay, that open to the exterior portions such as your digestive system, respiratory system, urinary system, and reproductive tracts. Those epithelial surfaces usually must be kept moist in order to reduce friction and facilitate absorption and secretion from those cells. For example, if this was cells of your trachea, for example, then you have secretions of mucus stuff coming out of your goblet cells. And here are those little cilia for moving those mucus up away from your lungs towards your oral cavity. And this will be the space within the oral cavity or opening of your trachea. This is the underneath connective tissue for the basement membrane, underneath the basement membrane. So remember, this is the epithelium, cilia, basement membrane, apical part of the epithelium, basal part of the epithelium, epithelial cells, and then you have connective tissue underneath, and that's where blood vessels comes in. Epithelial cells are avascular. Okay. So 2, there are serous membranes that we talked about in chapter 1, and they are for lining your internal cavities of the trunk, the main part of the body where all the important organs are other than your brain. It consists of mesothelium that is supported by areolar tissue, and they are there for functioning as minimizing friction between surfaces, because these tissues are areas where organs are rubbing against each other, and if there is a lubrication membrane between them, the tissues won't wear off as they're constantly rubbing against each other every day. Every minute, every second, your heart beats. Okay. And then you're breathing all the time, so your lungs are always doing movement of some sort, and they can't be rubbing against each other every time you breathe. Okay. So these serous membranes are usually thin and permeable to tissue fluids. Now, cutaneous membrane is a third type of membrane that we have that covers surfaces of the body, like our skin, for example. They consist of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. The fact that we know is keratinized already tell us that this is for external surfaces of the body, because internal surfaces a lot of times are non-keratinized. Keratinized cells are those of the external parts of the body, like your skin. And then the areolar tissues underneath is what reinforces by dense irregular connective tissue in the dermis layer. Remember how I said the stratified squamous epithelium is usually the epidermis of the skin, for example. And then this down here would be your dermis layer. And dense irregular connective tissue, where those lines I said that were, some are curved, some are straight, some are all over the place. So those are the irregular, no pattern orientation of these connective tissue underneath. And lastly, you have synovial membranes. Again, this is something we haven't mentioned before, but we will talk about it in chapter 9 when we talk about joints. So as a summary part of the 2 main types of tissue of the body, we have included synovial membrane as well. Those are synovial membranes. Synovial always means something related to joints. Okay. So these are what lines joint cavity and produces synovial fluid. So just like how serous membranes have serous fluid, synovial membranes have synovial fluid for lubrication as well. It consists of areolar tissues, atypical epithelium made up of macrophages and fibroblasts to regulate composition of the synovial fluid. That's this, for example, if this was the joint between two fingers, for example, if this was a finger, this was a finger bone, and here's that synovial fluid between the two bones, okay? So that's the synovial membrane right here that encloses the synovial fluid, and they must be very much regulated, because if a pathogen was to get into that area and cause an infection, then you have a joint infection, and we don't want that. That will be very painful, and that's why there are macrophages within that area to make sure that the synovial fluid would not get infected. Okay, so the third main type of tissue, okay, so we're down to the last two main types of tissue. Remember, we have epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. So we just got done talking about the very high variety ones, which is epithelial and the connective tissue, and now on to muscular tissue. So muscular tissues, of course, are specialized for contraction to produce movement, and there are three specific kinds of muscle tissue. First of them is called the skeletal muscle tissue, which contains long cylindrical muscle cells called muscle fiber. So every one of this right here, and they're long, and can keep extending this way, extending that way. But one of those is what's referred to as a muscle fiber. And we'll talk more about components of a muscle fiber when we get to chapter 10 about muscles. So each muscle fiber have anywhere around from several hundreds of nuclei. So that's why I said muscle fibers can be long, going on and on from here and going on and on from there, with multiple nuclei kind of situated in random areas along the muscle fiber. So muscle fiber is one of those odd cells that have more than one nuclei per cell. Okay. Now, muscle fibers themselves or skeletal muscles cannot divide, okay? They do not do cell division, but there are stem cells called myosatellite cells. These are a type of stem cells that live within muscle tissue that can form new muscle fibers. They can transform themselves into new muscle fibers. In chapter 10, we'll talk about how myosatellite cell stems from myoblast cell, which is muscle stem cells from embryonic stage that have formed muscle fibers. Some kind of stayed around, as a stem cells and turned themselves into myosatellite cells that kind of insert randomly in locations around the skeletal muscles. Now, so skeletal muscles itself, they can't divide. We can't let a muscle sort of grow into more muscle fibers on its own. Myosatellite cells, however, we can wait for them to do the repairing process of torn muscles, etc. Okay, but it's not the actual muscle fiber doing cell division, but myosatellite cells doing the differentiation as stem cells. There's still ongoing research learning about how these muscle stem cells work and how to activate them when we want them to generate new muscle fibers after a really bad muscle injury, for example, or if a person was severely burned where even they're down to their muscles, and if new muscles need to be regenerated, or how can we trigger that process is still in question and under sort of the regenerative research realm. Okay, so the distinguishing feature about skeletal muscles is that they contain what's called striations. You see these lines here? Okay, those lines are called striations, which are formed by repeating alternating patterns of contractile proteins called actin and myosin. Okay, actin and myosin. And we'll talk immensely about actin and myosin and what they do to result in a muscle contraction in very detail, microscopically speaking, when we get to chapter 10. Skeletal muscles don't contract unless an electrical signal arises from neurons. So they are voluntarily controlled, meaning that we are consciously aware of it moving. We have to tell it to move in order for it to move, unless it was a reflex that's triggered by a specific, for example, a doctor hitting your somewhere in your around your knee, and then it causes your leg to jerk a little bit. But other, like if we want to move our arm, our brain has to tell, hey, I want to move my arm to start writing notes. Okay, so that's skeletal muscles are moved only by voluntarily controlled manner. Okay, a second specific kind of muscle tissue is the cardiac muscle tissue. They are only found within the heart, so that's why it starts with cardiac. Cardiac has something to do with the hearts. Okay, so they're only found within the heart, nowhere else, and they are usually thinner and shorter than skeletal muscle cell. Now, they don't have myosatellite cells like skeletal muscle tissue, so they have very limited ability to repair themselves. So that's why when a person undergoes heart attack, depending how soon they get to the hospital, once those cardiac cell dies from not having enough oxygen, they're not going to come back. Okay. Now, in terms of characteristic of the muscle fiber on the microscopic view for cardiac muscle cells, they are also striated like skeletal muscles, but they have only one nucleus per cardiac muscle cell, okay? Unlike a muscular skeletal muscle fiber, which have anywhere around several hundred nuclei, cardiac muscle cell only have one nucleus. Some can have up to 5, okay? But, they don't have hundreds and hundreds of nuclei like muscle fiber, and they don't stretch for so long, okay? They're little cells that are much shorter than a muscle fiber. Okay, this is not a zoom out view enough where I can show you the beginning and end of a cardiac muscle cell, but they're separated by what's called intercalated disc. Okay, so that's a distinguishing feature for identifying cardiac muscle tissue compared with skeletal muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue do not have intercalated disc, okay, and they're very obvious sort of vertical lines like this that separates between cardiac cells. And these intercalated discs results from that connection we were talking about, intercellular connections, gap junctions, when we were talking about epithelial cells. Those same gap junctions are what's happening within the intercalated disc for ions to travel from one cardiac cell to another cardiac muscle cell. And that's how our heart can beat in a coordinated manner for a set rhythm. Now, contrary to skeletal muscle cells, cardiac muscle cells are involuntary, meaning that we can't consciously control our heartbeats. Now, it's actually kind of nice. Imagine out of every day that we're thinking through so much stuff, trying to learn this anatomy and physiology, for example, our brain is already bombarded enough with information. Imagine if on the side you still got to, hey, heart, let's beat. Hey, heart, let's beat. And every single second you got to tell your heart to beat. That's a job, like a full-time job itself. So it's good that we can't voluntarily control our heartbeat. Okay, let our brain take care of that stuff. Our autonomic nervous system takes care of all that stuff for us involuntarily. And we'll talk about how they do that when we get to the last chapter as a preview into the next semester when we go over cardiovascular system. But there are specific type of cells called pacemaker cells that set the regular rate of heart contractions, and they're the ones that's going to trigger those electrical impulses to come through on the cardiac muscle tissue for that regulated heartbeat. When the brain has to come into place is when there needs to be homeostasis. For example, a person is bleeding uncontrollably that we've talked about in chapter 1, talking about homeostasis of blood pressure. Someone's bleeding a lot, they're losing blood pressure. As a normal homeostatic response to that is your heart will need to pump faster to supply the rest of the body with more blood. More blood means higher blood pressure, bringing it back up to homeostasis. So In cases like that, then your brain would have extra signal coming through to increase your heartbeat or decrease your heartbeat. Okay, but normally speaking, your rhythm is set by your pacemaker cells. Okay, and this is involuntary control. Okay, no voluntary control over cardiac muscle tissue, and it's for our own good in a sense. Okay, the third specific kind of muscle tissue is smooth muscle tissue, which are found in walls of blood vessels, around hollow organs, in layers around digestive, respiratory, and reproductive tracts. Okay, they in sort of characteristics wise, looking at physical features, they are short, spindle shaped. Okay, kind of like those squamous cells I was talking about, how I said they kind of shape like scales. So that's how smooth muscle tissue cells look like. Okay, so skeletal muscle cells are lines like this. Okay, a whole muscle fiber all along with multiple nuclei all over the place. Okay, cardiac muscle cells are kind of branch cells that goes all over the place and can have intercalated disc, okay, with striations, okay, one nuclei in each cell, okay, kind of branch formation. They can be branch, whereas smooth muscle cells are then those spindle shape that form layers of smooth muscles. So these three types of muscle looks very different from each other. There will be models of these three different types of muscle tissue when we get to microscopic anatomy of muscle tissue, that particular lab. So you'll really see the difference between the three types of tissue then. Now, for smooth muscle tissue, out of the three types of muscle tissue, smooth muscle is the one that can have the greatest capacity to regenerate through cell division. Okay, skeletal muscles, they can't divide, but they can rely on myosatellite cells. Cardiac muscle cells, they can't divide, and there's no myosatellite cells. So usually, a lot of times, if heart muscle cells dies, that's the end of the story. Okay, so that is why it is very critical that someone who has a heart attack is rushed to the hospital as soon as they can to minimize the damage to their cardiac muscle cells. And then lastly, smooth muscle cells is with that highest capacity to regenerate. If you come to think of it, these are in areas where there's things moving in it all the time, digestive, respiratory, reproductive. So if they're, let's say epithelial cells were abraded for some reason and all the way down to the muscle tissues, at least damages around that area is not too big of a problem and they can regenerate through cell division. Okay. Now, distinguishing feature under the microscope for smooth muscle cell is that they do not have striation. No striation. You don't see lines going through them like that. Okay, they're just these squamous, scale-like looking things, spindle shape looking things. Okay, and they are involuntary. Okay, so they're pretty straightforward to remember, but feel free to put these tissues and the characteristics they have on a note card or a table of some sort to help you remember what tissue does what and what are some distinguishing feature about that particular tissue. Okay, for sure, for muscular tissue is pretty easy. You have skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle, and then skeletal muscle is the only one that's voluntary. Cardiac and smooth is involuntary. Cardiac and skeletal muscles can't do cell division, whereas smooth muscle cell can divide. Skeletal muscle cells, however, can be regenerated through myosatellite cells, which are stem cells of muscular system. Okay? All right. The last main type of tissue is nervous tissue, and this tissue is the simplest of the four. There are only two main types of cells. There's no specific kind or whatsoever like the muscle tissue. There's just two main types of cells, which is neurons and neuroglia cells. This type of tissue is specialized for propagation of electrical impulses from one region of the body to another. 98% of the nervous tissue in our body is residing within the brain and the spinal cord. There are peripheral neurons, but most of those are within the brain and the spinal cord, which is our central nervous system. When we get to the nervous system, we'll divide the nervous system into central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. So brain and spinal cord is our central nervous system, very critical part of our nervous system. And then peripheral nervous system is our peripheral neurons, okay, within our limbs, our fingers, our bottoms of our feet, etc. Okay. So neurons are considered as one of the longest cell in the body. One neuron can be up to a meter in length. Okay, that's even longer than a muscle fiber. Neuroglia cells are those that support or repair, if possible, for nervous tissue. Okay, because neurons, just like your cardiac muscle cells, they can't do cell division. They don't have centrioles. So what happens with them, if a neuron is damaged, it is up to Mother Nature whether they can repair themselves. Not surprisingly, they can repair, but only under certain circumstances and in particular part of the body. We'll talk about that repair process called Wallerian regeneration in chapter 12 when we go over nervous tissue. But they do have that minimal capacity to hopefully repair our neurons, but only under very stringent cases. Okay. And so neuroglia cells also supply nutrients for neurons. So neurons are the main key players for nervous tissue. Neuroglia are those little guys that are supporting and nurturing the neurons in a sense. Okay. So under the microscope, you will see this big neuron with the cell body, okay, and then you see these dots all over the place close by. So those are the neuroglia cells, okay, little dots. Neurons are a lot bigger than neuroglia cells, and we'll talk about the specific 6 types of neuroglia cells we have in the body when we get to the nervous system chapter. All right. So neurons, like I said, they can't divide, but under normal circumstances anyway, but we're like, just like muscle, there have been sort of ways in research, dealing with how we can recover or regenerate nervous tissue. If something like that can happen, then Alzheimer's or anything to do with the brain, deterioration of the brain, can possibly have a treatment. Okay, but that's all still under research right now. Okay. Now, the neuron, parts of the neuron, for now, you just have to know 3 simple parts: cell body, dendrites, and axons. So this is the cell body itself, which contains the nucleus. These little branch rooty looking things here next to the cell body are the dendrites. And then these down here is the end called axon terminal, but the entire thing here is considered as the axon. Okay, so these are axon terminals. This is the axon. Okay. So cell body is the main part of the neuron. Dendrites are for receiving messages coming from another neuron. And then electrical signal always go in one direction from the cell body down the length of the axon to axon terminals. And these axon terminals can connect with another neuron or connect to a muscle fiber for initiating the contraction process, which we will talk about in chapter 10 and 12 for neuron to muscle electrical impulse, neuromuscular junction, and from neuron to neuron, how does electrical impulses get through, okay? That's the tough part of, I would say 2401. The toughest part of 2401 is trying to get through the process of molecularly how electrical impulses travel from one end of the neuron to the other end of the neuron and then onto either a neuron or a muscle fiber. Okay. Again, last time for tissue identification practice, the type of tissue is either muscle tissue or nervous tissue. This one is nervous tissue. These 3 are then your muscle tissue. How about what specific kind of muscle tissue there is? Well, let's look at this one. Well, there's striations. Okay, I see lots of little lines vertically going across, but do I see intercalated disc? Do I see branching of cells, or are they just straight cylindrical muscle fibers? Well, they are all just cylindrical muscle fiber. So this is skeletal muscles. And then this is cardiac muscle tissue. Okay, skeletal muscle, don't forget tissue. Now you see these areas of intercalated disc. Okay, so you see one cell here, and it kind of somewhat branches a little bit like that. And here is another branching off of the cell. Okay. So it's sometimes hard to see those intercalated discs, but you will see faint lines going down like that, okay, all the way across the different cardiac muscle cells, okay, but it's not long like this with lots of striations, okay. And then lastly, you have smooth muscle tissue, smooth muscle tissue. And because they're usually residing underneath intestines or stomach, etc., you will usually see epithelial cells that look somewhat like your simple columnar epithelial cells. And then what's underneath that right here is your smooth muscle tissue. Okay, and those smooth muscle tissues usually right next to your epithelial tissue. So you can see that they are kind of like this, okay, like the little cells that are spindle shaped lining up against each other. So that's another key for you for smooth muscle tissue is they will have, I will purposely show the epithelial part of the organ to show you, hey, this may be a smooth tissue, okay? Whereas cardiac and skeletal muscle, I won't show any epithelial tissue, okay? Okay, and then for nervous tissue, the type is nervous tissue. The specific kind is also nervous tissue. Okay, there's no split of different type of nervous tissue. And then these are your neurons. Okay, so any of these alien-looking things like that, here, those are all neurons. And these dots all over the place are nuclei of your neuroglia cells. Okay, neuroglia cells. Okay, so those dots all over the place is nuclei of neuroglia cells that are supporting your neurons. Okay, so the last topic in this chapter is the process of inflammation in tissues. So when a tissue is injured after impact, for example, any type of abrasion, distortion, chemical irritation, infection, or you accidentally touch something that's extremely hot or extremely cold, both of which will burn your skin a little bit. All of those can result in exposure to pathogens and toxins in a sense, okay, which then will activate mast cells. So mast cells are one of the first to act in cases where there's potential infection. Mast cells will release histamine to stimulate the process of inflammation. And remember that inflammation is just a process that will isolate the injured area, while damaged cells, tissue components, microorganisms are going to be cleaned up. Okay, so there's a lot of things that inflammation will trigger to help with all of this stuff that's happening in an area that's inflamed. So even though inflammation feels very painful, it's something that we don't want happening, but the whole nature of inflammation itself is to induce healing and repair process, okay? So there are 3 effects that inflammation triggers, which is increased blood flow to the area, okay, which is triggered due to vasodilation. Your blood vessels dilate, called vasodilation. kind of like what we talked about in terms of body temperature in chapter 1, okay, where if it heats up, it's because either it's because you're hot, your vessel dilate, or because your tissue is inflamed and your blood vessels dilate. And your blood vessels dilating in diameter will increase blood flow. The other thing vessel dilation will increase is permeability of the blood vessel, okay? So this is what's going to allow plasma to diffuse into your injured tissue, in a sense, draining anything that needs to be removed, and also that increased permeability is going to allow for repair factors to come into that spot and try to clean up and repair the wound for you. And pain, lastly, the third effect is pain, which is due to stimulation of nerve endings in the area from chemicals released by mast cells. In a sense, alerting your body, hey, there's something going on in this area, so you better be aware of it and not touch it, not move it around, things like that, depending on how severe the inflammation is. And sometimes inflammation sometimes would go with a fever as well. And it's all part of the alerting process, telling the organism or your body that, hey, something's wrong, and your body's working very hard to fight it and help you overcome it. Now, these three effects of inflammation can lead to these results right here. So these are the effects of inflammation. Direct effects, and then this is what's going to cause. Why do we need to have increased blood flow? Why do we need increased vessel permeability? Okay, it's all for example, increased local temperature. Okay, so increased local temperature can actually prevent growth of bacteria, and also speed up chemical movement and reaction process. That's the whole reason why we have fever when we have an infection of some sort, is to slow down the growth of bacteria and also increase the metabolic process of helping our enzymatic mechanisms of healing. I think we're going to talk about that in the second semester, where 1 degree increase in temperature, in body temperature, is equivalent to 10 times the amount of enzymatic activity that can happen. So that's why we do want that increase locally at that area of inflammation. All of that permeability, blood vessel permeability, will also increase oxygen and nutrient delivery to the site of injury to help, again, with the repair process. And there will be increased phagocytosis as well, where debris and pathogens will be eaten up by white blood cells like macrophages, or other macrophages like neutrophils and eosinophils. And those white blood cells will squeeze through those blood vessels. We'll talk about this process called diapetesis in the second semester, how they are able to reach the site of inflammation. But all of this inflammation is to increase the rate of phagocytosis done by our white blood cell to get rid of any pathogen that happen to enter into our injured site. And the overall enhanced circulation in an inflamed site will carry away toxins and wastes and sends them either to the kidneys for excretion out of the liver, in urine or out of the body, or towards the liver for inactivation, because the liver is a big organ that does a whole bunch of stuff. There's a whole bunch of functions we'll go over for the liver in second semester. It makes a lot of proteins, but one of the big thing that liver does for us is detoxification. So any toxins we have in the body will go through the liver first. Liver will have some way to neutralize it for us. And then the kidney is for removing those toxins in form of urine. So the cleanup process can be done in a matter of hours to even days, depending on severity of the inflammation and how far or how deep the cut is, or how much pathogen has been able to enter into the injured area. And then once the cleanup process is done, the tissue regeneration will then be carried out by fibroblasts and form scar tissues. Most epithelia and connective tissue other than cartilage will regenerate, okay, because we talked about that they're able to regenerate, not cartilage, but the other type of tissues, the epithelia and connective tissue. Smooth muscles will also regenerate, but skeletal, cardiac muscles, tissue, and nervous tissue and cartilage will regenerate poorly, if at all, okay? All right. So, for example, if during a heart attack, like I was talking about, an area of the heart does not receive enough oxygen and starts dying, those will be done for. And whereas connective tissues can be repaired through cell division processes, okay? Now, those cardiac muscle tissues that have died due to deoxygenation during from a heart attack, they would still be replenished in a sense by fibrous tissue, a process called fibrosis, which is scarring of the heart. So that area of the heart will no longer contract as they should. So sometimes people can still survive after a heart attack. Maybe only a small portion of their heart have this fibrosis going on where scar tissues has formed, but it's a small area that is not, contributing a huge amount to the overall contractility of your heart muscles. We'll talk about which side you would rather have scar tissues forming when we get to the cardiovascular system of the heart in the next semester, okay? There are some areas where it is more tolerable than another area in the heart. All right, I will wrap up this chapter with this interesting example of tissue cleanup and repair. Some of you may have heard of what's called the brown recluse spider, which can actually release a necrotic venom that causes tissues to die. Okay, and that's what the whole necrotic word means, is death of tissues. Okay, so in order for those tissues to heal within the area where the spider has bitten or released venom into, the necrotic or dead tissue usually will need to be removed first in a process called debridement. Okay, so debridement is the process of removing necrotic tissues. Now, a very interesting type of therapy, interesting but maybe gross for some of you. I'll upload another video of this therapy called Maggot debridement therapy. Again, video viewer discretion. Don't be eating noodles or rice or something while you're watching this video. But it's very interesting, being in healthcare, wanting to be in health professions, you're going to be seeing a lot of gross things, okay? So, you might as well get used to it. So there exists a class of flies called blowflies, where at its larva stage, as maggots, they will eat only dead tissue while leaving the healthy tissue completely alone. Now, this particular type of medical procedure called maggot debridement therapy is not just you going out, harvesting some blowflies and start putting their maggots into a patient's wound, okay? There are medical grade maggots that, clinics can purchase, okay? Because these medical grade ones are for sure clean. You don't want to be putting dirty maggots into the infected wound and gets it even worse. But these maggots will have the ability to debride wound beds and starts eating up all those dead tissues around the wound, okay? Especially in areas of, for example, diabetic foot always happens all the time where, bacteria starts eating into that space, okay? Or if someone, like I said, had a brown recluse spider cut, then they would have to have these, put these maggots within the area of injury, and they will provide antimicrobial activity, believe it or not, okay? And also stimulate wound healing. And compared to surgery, they do a pretty good job of not cutting into healthy tissues, preserving all the healthy tissues and just removing all the dead tissue. And the most attractive part of it is that it's a low cost. Okay, it's pretty cheap to buy these maggots. I'm not sure whether hospitals right now, actively practice this, but I've heard of this debridement therapy from another A&P faculty, and I found it very, very interesting. So I wanted to share with you guys as well. So usually about 40 to 50 maggots are inserted into the wound area. They're tiny rice-like size white, very clean, little guys, okay, at first when you put it into the wound, okay, and then they would put some dressing around it where they're left within the wound area, and after 48 hours, they will be checked for progress, and this is when the growth moment happens, because when you open up the wound, which the video I upload to eCampus will show, is these fat larvas, maggots that's becoming, kind of large and dark color because they've been eaten and growing within the area. But they were eating dead tissues in that wound area, and it's for a good purpose. Okay, so this procedure has helped either a diabetic patient or those that have that brown recluse spider bites. Okay, and they can avoid amputations because those necrotic tissue can be effectively removed by these maggots, and then new tissues can regenerate after their removal. Okay, so just the grossest part is the part of removing the maggots from the wound, usually either by, usually of course they do it by sort of rinsing out the wound and rinsing out all the old maggots that have now grown into a large size. Okay, you don't wait until they become flies. Okay, they are removed after 48 hours. Okay. All right. So be on the lookout on the next video for the video on maggot debridement therapy. I'll tell you the beginning. There's a long beginning, so I'll show you where to start. Okay. All right, so let's go through these practice questions for chapter 4, and then we'll be done with this chapter. And I know it's been a long chapter, and that's why I've set 2 days for tissues because of how long it is. So make sure you spend the time and not cram last minute for this chapter. There's just so much information. Okay, so the epithelia that line body cavities and blood vessels are called simple squamous. Okay, remember those mesothelium that line body cavities, and then there's the blood vessels that are lined by simple squamous epithelium. A gland that has no ducts and secretes directly into extracellular fluid or blood is called an endocrine gland. Remember, endocrine keyword is ductless, and then exocrine needs the help of a duct. What is the functional significance of gap junctions? They share ions between adjacent cells because they have these connexins that forms channels between two cells. For example, one cell here, and there's gap junctions formed by these cylinder with a central pore in them for ions to pass through from one cell to the next. If a person has a herniated intervertebral disc, which type of cartilage has been damaged? Intervertebral disc withstand compression, so they need to be strong. So fibrocartilage, the toughest of the 3 types of cartilage. 3 specific kinds of cartilage. Why does cartilage heal so slowly? Is because they don't have blood supply. They are avascular. So, blood supply is what's necessary for proper wound healing. Okay. Lack of vitamin C in the diet interferes with the ability of fibroblasts to produce collagen. What effect might this interference have on connective tissue? What does collagen provide? Okay, strength. Okay, they provide structural strength. So that is why these tissue without collagen will become weak, and they're very much prone to damage. What is the most abundant protein fiber in the connective tissue? Collagen. We mentioned collagen a gazillion times in this tissue chapter. Which terms below are mismatched? You have pseudostratified columnar epithelium trachea. That's correct. Stratified columnar small intestine. Simple squamous endothelium. That's correct for blood vessels. Simple cuboidal kidney tubules. Correct. So what's incorrect is choice B, which shouldn't be stratified columnar. It should be simple columnar epithelium for small intestine, stomach, and the large intestine. We rarely have stratified columnar epithelium. Which epithelial tissue would be found lining the ureters and the urinary bladder? Would be transitional epithelial tissue. Remember, I said this is the special kind of tissue that is only within the urinary system. Identify this, and it is because they can transform between cuboidal and squamous cells depending on whether you have a distended bladder or an empty bladder. Identify the cell type below that assists the function of neurons and has a supportive role within the nervous system, neuroglia. Remember, nervous system is made up of two types of cells, neurons and neuroglia. Neurons are the ones that's doing the electrical impulses and passing it along. Neuroglia are the ones that are supporting neuron cells. Okay, and that's all I have, and I will see you in chapter 5.